It was one of those quiet Saturday mornings that made you want to slow down and enjoy life a little. The sky was bright. The air had that early summer warmth, and for once, everything in the neighborhood seemed peaceful. After months of long hours at work, Mark finally had a weekend off. He had planned something simple, just a small garage sale in his driveway to clear out things he no longer needed. He wasn't trying to make a fortune. He just wanted to get rid of old tools, an extra lawnmower, and a few boxes filled with things that had been sitting untouched for years. For Mark, it was more about cleaning up and meeting a few neighbors than about the money. By 7 in the morning, his driveway was neatly organized. A few folding tables held different items: books, lamps, old DVDs, and some home improvement tools. He'd even placed a sign at the end of the street that said, "Garage sale, Saturday only." The first few visitors arrived early. An elderly couple from down the block came by, followed by a young family who lived across the park. Mark smiled, chatted, and even gave some items away for free when people didn't have exact change. He enjoyed seeing people's faces light up when they found something useful. It reminded him of simpler times. But peace in this neighborhood never lasted long, not with the homeowners association around. And at the center of that was Karen. Karen wasn't officially the president of the HOA, but everyone knew she acted like she was. She walked around every day, clipboard in hand, checking lawns, fences, and driveways. If a trash can was left out a little too long, she'd send a friendly reminder. If a car was parked an inch off the curb, she'd snap a photo and email the board. Some neighbors joked that she treated the community like her own private kingdom. Mark had dealt with her before, but always with patience. He wasn't the kind of person who liked conflict. He believed most problems could be handled calmly. But today, Karen seemed to be on a mission. Around 9 in the morning, Mark saw her walking toward his house. Even from a distance, he could tell she wasn't coming for a friendly chat. She had her usual expression: tight lips, raised eyebrows, and that determined walk that meant she had found something to complain about. "Good morning, Karen," Mark greeted politely as she approached. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She didn't smile. "Mark, do you have a permit for this?" she asked sharply, waving her clipboard. "For what?" he replied, still keeping his voice calm. "This garage sale. You can't just set up a store in your driveway. It's against the HOA guidelines." Mark paused for a moment, trying to stay patient. "Actually," he said, "I checked with Paul from the board. He said as long as it's a one-day personal sale, it's fine." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Paul doesn't make the rules. The HOA does. And as far as I'm concerned, this looks like a commercial activity. You're taking up the sidewalk, you've got cars stopping on the street, it's disruptive." He glanced at the street. There were only 2 cars parked nearby. One belonged to the couple still browsing, and the other was his neighbor from across the way. "I don't think I'm disturbing anyone," he said gently. "It's just a few neighbors dropping by." Karen crossed her arms. "It doesn't matter what you think. Rules are rules. You didn't get written approval, so this needs to end immediately." Mark took a deep breath. Years of police work had taught him how to handle difficult people. He wasn't about to lose his temper over something so small. "Karen," he said calmly, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not breaking any laws or causing any trouble. This sale will be done by noon." She didn't like that answer. "I'll be reporting this to the HOA," she said coldly, "and if necessary, to the local authorities. We can't have people thinking they can just do whatever they want here." Then she turned and walked away without another word. The couple nearby exchanged uneasy glances. "Is everything okay?" the woman asked quietly. Mark smiled reassuringly. "It's fine," he said. "Just the HOA doing its job." He tried to brush it off. He went back to chatting with visitors, making small talk and keeping the mood light. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. It wasn't the first time Karen had gone overboard. A few months back, she'd left a note on someone's door because their grass had grown half an inch above regulation height. Before that, she'd argued with a family about a basketball hoop their kids had placed near the driveway. It was always something. She seemed to live for these tiny battles. By 10 o'clock, more neighbors had come by, most of them friendly and curious. One man, Jeff, joked about Karen's visit. "She already passed by my house twice this morning," he said, laughing. "She probably keeps a list of who she plans to bother each weekend." Mark chuckled. "As long as she stays busy, maybe she won't cause too much trouble." "Yeah, good luck with that," Jeff replied. The laughter helped lighten the mood. But around 10:30, a black SUV pulled up slowly in front of Mark's house. The window rolled down and Karen's voice called out, "You'll be hearing from the HOA, Mark, and I've already made a few calls." Mark sighed quietly. He didn't even bother replying. He'd dealt with worse confrontations in his career. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how far she'd actually take it. About 15 minutes later, the sound of police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. A few people looked up curiously. When a marked patrol car turned onto the street, a wave of whispers spread among the small crowd. "Someone called the cops?" a neighbor asked. Mark didn't answer right away. But when the car stopped in front of his driveway, he had a feeling he already knew who was behind it. Two uniformed officers stepped out, looking around calmly. One of them, Officer Daniels, spotted Mark immediately, and his expression changed from neutral to surprised. "Chief Reynolds?" Daniels said, his tone shifting with respect. "I didn't expect to see you here, sir." Karen, who had appeared out of nowhere again, froze mid-step. "Chief?" she repeated, clearly confused. Mark smiled faintly. "Good to see you, Daniels. Just enjoying my day off." The second officer, a younger recruit, looked startled. "Sir, we got a call about an unlicensed commercial sale happening here." Mark nodded. "Yeah, that would be this garage sale. Nothing commercial about it, just clearing out old stuff. Feel free to take a look around." Daniels turned to Karen, who was still standing there, clutching her clipboard tightly. "Ma'am, were you the one who made the call?" "Yes," she said firmly. "He's violating HOA rules. I wanted this handled properly." Daniels tried to keep a straight face, but the situation was becoming awkward. "Ma'am, HOA rules aren't a police matter unless there's an actual violation of city code." Karen frowned. "So you're just going to ignore this?" The officer shook his head patiently. "We're not ignoring anything, ma'am. But there's nothing illegal about holding a private garage sale. As long as it's peaceful and doesn't block traffic, it's fine." Karen's voice rose slightly. "But the rules," Daniels gently interrupted. "HOA guidelines are internal. We can't enforce them." The younger officer nodded, trying not to smile. Mark could see the frustration on Karen's face. It was probably the first time someone had stood up to her in front of others. After a brief pause, Mark said softly, "You see, Karen, everything's fine. I'll wrap up by noon like I promised." She stared at him, still processing the word chief. "You're a police officer?" Mark hesitated, then answered simply, "Detective Chief, actually. I work downtown. I'm just off duty today." The look on her face was priceless. The color drained slightly from her cheeks as she realized she'd just called the police on someone who outranked them. The officers exchanged polite smiles with Mark before returning to their car. "Sorry for the interruption, Chief. We'll let dispatch know it's resolved." "No problem, Daniels. Appreciate you coming by." As the patrol car drove away, Karen stood there silently. The neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, were clearly trying not to laugh. Someone whispered, "Oh, she's not going to like this one bit." Mark turned back to his tables and continued helping people, pretending the whole thing hadn't happened. But Karen, humiliated, lingered for a few seconds before storming off again, muttering something about rules being rules. Once she was gone, the small crowd relaxed. A few people approached Mark and started asking him questions, not about the sale, but about his work. "I didn't know you were a detective," one man said. "That's pretty cool," Mark smiled. "It's not as exciting as it sounds. Mostly paperwork these days." "Still," another neighbor added, "I bet Karen's going to think twice before calling anyone again." Everyone laughed. The tension was gone, replaced by light-hearted conversation. Mark was polite but didn't brag. He didn't like drawing attention to his job, especially not like this. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of irony. The one person who always tried to enforce every little rule had finally gone too far, and learned a lesson she wouldn't forget soon. The rest of the morning went smoothly. More neighbors stopped by, some bringing coffee or chatting about the events of the morning. People who had been distant before now seemed more open, even friendly. By noon, the sale was nearly done. Only a few items remained on the tables, and the once busy driveway was quiet again. Mark packed up slowly, feeling satisfied. He hadn't made much money, but he'd made something better. Connections with people who now saw him as more than just another resident. As he was closing up, Jeff walked over again, grinning. "Well, that was entertaining," he said. "I've lived here for 10 years and I don't think anyone's ever put Karen in her place like that." Mark chuckled. "I didn't mean to. I was just minding my own business. Yeah, well, Jeff replied, she had it coming. You handled it better than most would. Mark smiled. You learned to stay calm in my line of work. Arguing only makes things worse, Jeff nodded. You're a better man than me, that's for sure. After his neighbor left, Mark sat for a while, enjoying the quiet. The day had turned out far more interesting than expected, but something told him this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily. She'd probably be on the phone with the HOA president already, trying to find another angle. Still, he wasn't worried. He'd faced far tougher people than a nosy neighbor. And if Karen wanted to play by the rules, he knew those rules better than she did. What he didn't know yet was that the next time their paths crossed, things would take a very different turn, one that would expose far more than petty HOA drama. For now, though, Mark simply leaned back, took a sip of cold coffee, and smiled. The sun was still shining, and peace, at least for the moment, had returned to his little corner of the world. The following week passed quietly, almost too quietly. The garage sale had come and gone, and life in the neighborhood returned to its usual routine. Or at least it seemed that way on the surface. Mark went back to his regular work schedule, early mornings and long days. He was one of those people who didn't talk much about his job. Most neighbors only knew he worked in law enforcement, but they didn't realize just how high up he was. He liked it that way. He preferred blending in, being part of the community without drawing attention, but that peaceful illusion didn't last long. On Wednesday evening, as Mark was getting home from work, he noticed a letter taped to his front door. The envelope had the familiar HOA logo in the corner. He sighed. There was only one person who would have gone to this trouble. He peeled it off and opened it right there on the porch. Inside was a printed notice that read, HOA Violation Notice. Unsanctioned commercial activity, dear resident. It has come to our attention that you recently conducted a commercial sale on your property without written approval. This is a violation of HOA Regulations, Section 5.3, regarding unauthorized business activity within the neighborhood. Please note that further violations may result in fines or legal action. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, HOA Compliance Coordinator. Mark couldn't help but shake his head. Compliance Coordinator, he muttered. That wasn't even an official title. The HOA board had a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. No coordinator. It was something Karen had clearly given herself to sound more important. He walked inside, tossed the paper on his kitchen counter, and poured himself a glass of water. He wasn't angry. If anything, he was amused. But he knew better than to ignore paperwork, even from someone like her. So the next day, during his lunch break, he decided to stop by the HOA office. It was a small room in the clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. Inside, a couple of volunteers were sorting through folders. Behind the front desk sat Paul, the real HOA president, a kind, middle-aged man who always tried to keep the peace. Chief Reynolds, Paul said with a smile as soon as he saw him. What brings you here? Mark handed him the notice. Got this on my door yesterday. Thought we'd clear it up before it turns into something bigger. Paul read the letter and frowned. Ah, yes, Karen. He rubbed his forehead. She's been a bit overzealous lately. That's one way to put it, Mark replied calmly. I just wanted to make sure there's no official issue. There isn't, Paul said quickly. You're fine. We actually allow one garage sale per household per year. She knows that. I'll talk to her about overstepping again. Mark nodded. Appreciate that. As he turned to leave, Paul added, Between you and me, you're not the only one she's been bothering. A few residents have complained about her going through their mailboxes and taking photos of their yards. We're trying to rein her in, but she always finds a loophole. Mark gave a small smile. I'll stay out of it as long as she stays out of mine. Unfortunately, that wouldn't happen. That same evening, Mark was sitting in his backyard, enjoying the sunset, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. You might want to check the HOA website, the message said. Mark frowned, logged onto the site, and sure enough, there it was. A public notice on the homepage about unauthorized sales. It didn't name him directly, but the timing was no coincidence. The post warned residents not to encourage or participate in activities that could disturb neighborhood peace and reminded everyone that violations will be reported to local authorities if necessary. It was signed once again By Karen. He let out a quiet laugh and shook his head. She was relentless. Most people would have been embarrassed after the police incident, but Karen seemed to double down instead. Maybe it was pride. Maybe she couldn't stand being wrong. Whatever it was, she clearly hadn't learned her lesson. The next morning, when Mark left for work, he noticed something else. His mailbox had been opened. It wasn't damaged, just left slightly ajar. That alone wouldn't mean much, except for one thing. He'd seen Karen walking her dog past his house earlier that morning. He decided not to confront her right away. Instead, he went to work as usual. But during a break, he mentioned the situation to one of his colleagues, Officer Daniels, the same one who had shown up at the garage sale. Daniels laughed softly when he heard the story. "She called us again yesterday, he said. About what this time? She said someone in your neighborhood was running a suspicious operation out of their garage. We sent a car to check. Turned out it was a teenage kid fixing bikes." Mark sighed. "She's going to drive that whole neighborhood crazy." "She already has," Daniels replied. "We've had at least 4 non-emergency calls from that address this month. I'll flag it next time so we know what we're walking into." Mark thanked him and hung up. But as much as he tried to ignore it, something about the situation didn't sit right. That evening, when he got home, he found another envelope taped to his door. This time, thicker. Inside were 2 forms. One was another warning notice, and the other was a payment request for an HOA fine of $150. Now that was different. Mark sat at his desk and read through it carefully. The document looked official at first glance. HOA letterhead, signature, and all. But there was one big problem. The treasurer's signature at the bottom wasn't real. He'd met the treasurer before, and this wasn't her handwriting. That raised a question. If Karen was sending fake fines, where was that money going? The next morning, Mark decided to make a few calls, not as a resident, but as a detective. He contacted a friend at the city records office to confirm whether the HOA had recently filed any new fee schedules. The answer came back clear. No changes had been filed in over a year. So who had authorized those fines? He didn't jump to conclusions right away. Instead, he started quietly asking questions around the neighborhood. Over the next few days, he spoke to several residents casually, while walking his dog or checking the mail. It didn't take long for a pattern to appear. 3 different homeowners mentioned receiving violation notices from Karen in the past few months. Each had paid fines between $50 and $200 directly to her for processing. None of them had ever received receipts. One woman said, "She told me it was for landscaping violations because my flowers were too close to the sidewalk. I didn't want any trouble, so I paid." Another man admitted, "She came to my door saying my roof color didn't meet HOA standards. I gave her a check just to get her to leave me alone." Mark kept his face neutral and thanked them for their time. But inside he knew what this was starting to look like. Fraud. Still, he wanted proof. So he went to the next HOA meeting that Saturday morning. The community room was full more than usual. People had started showing up because of Karen's recent posts online. As Mark entered, a few neighbors greeted him quietly. Karen, sitting near the front, stiffened when she saw him. She gave a tight smile, pretending to be friendly. "Good morning, everyone," Paul began. "Let's keep things civil today. We'll start with community updates, then take questions." The meeting went as expected for the first half hour. Budget updates, landscaping plans, minor maintenance issues. Then Karen raised her hand. "I'd like to address the issue of unauthorized activities again," she said, her tone sharp. "We've had several violations lately, including unapproved sales and property use that goes against our standards. I believe we need stricter enforcement and higher penalties." A few people murmured in disagreement. Paul frowned slightly. "Karen, we've already talked about that. The board has not approved any new penalties." Karen crossed her arms. "Maybe not yet, but we can't let people think they can break the rules and get away with it." That's when Mark spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, Karen, could you clarify what penalties you're talking about?" She glanced at him, clearly uncomfortable. "You know what I mean. The HOA has the right to fine residents for violations." "That's true," Mark said, "but only if the board approves those fines and records them properly." I checked with the treasurer. No new fines have been approved in over a year. The room went quiet. Karen's eyes darted toward the board members, then back to him. "Well, maybe there was a misunderstanding." Mark tilted his head slightly. A misunderstanding that led to people paying you directly? Because several residents told me they handed you money for fines you said were official. The air in the room froze. Paul's face went pale. Wait, what? He asked, turning to Karen. People gave you money. Karen's voice wavered slightly. It was just temporary. I was collecting to make things easier. I was going to turn it in later. Paul looked shocked. Karen, that's not how we handle funds. All payments go through the HOA account, not individuals. A low murmur spread across the room. People began whispering, some angry, others surprised. Mark stayed quiet, letting the moment unfold. He didn't need to push further. Karen was unraveling all on her own. Finally, Paul stood. We'll be reviewing this immediately. Karen, I think it's best if you step down from any enforcement role until we figure out what's going on. Karen tried to protest, but the room had turned against her. The same neighbors she used to intimidate were now glaring at her, whispering to each other about fines and missing money. Mark didn't say another word. He simply gathered his things and walked out once the meeting adjourned. He didn't need to make a scene. The truth was already working its way through the neighborhood. That night he sat on his porch again, watching the streetlights flicker on. For the first time in a while, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't planned to get involved, but maybe it was better this way. People like Karen always thought they could hide behind rules and authority, but the truth had a way of catching up. Still, he couldn't help but wonder just how deep this went. If she'd been taking money from residents, where else had those funds gone? Was she working alone, or did someone else in the HOA know? He decided not to jump ahead. There would be time for that. For now, he'd let the board handle the internal fallout. But 2 days later, he got a call from Paul. The HOA's official account records didn't match the deposits. Several checks had never been recorded at all. And the board treasurer insisted she'd never even seen them. That confirmed what Mark already suspected. Karen hadn't just been overstepping. She'd been stealing. Paul sounded worried. Mark, I don't want to accuse anyone without proof, but this looks serious. What should we do? Mark's answer was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had spent his life following evidence. Leave it with me. I'll look into it quietly. If there's something to find, I'll find it. He hung up the phone, stood by his window, and looked out at the neighborhood. The lawns were trimmed, the houses tidy, everything peaceful on the surface. But beneath that, something rotten had been festering for a long time. And now it was finally starting to show. Karen had made one big mistake. She thought calling the authorities on him would scare him off. She had no idea she'd just drawn the attention of someone who was not only part of law enforcement, but a man who lived for the truth. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Over the next few days, the neighborhood felt different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. People who used to avoid talking about the homeowners association now stopped each other on the sidewalks, whispering quietly, asking if the rumors were true. Karen's car wasn't parked in its usual spot. Her curtains were drawn, and for once her daily patrols had stopped. It was strange seeing the street without her watchful eyes, but for Mark, this wasn't over. He had promised Paul that he'd look into it quietly, and when he made a promise like that, he meant it. Years on the force had taught him that small lies often hid bigger ones, and this time he had a strong feeling that what they'd seen so far was only the surface. He started simple, by gathering information the same way he'd do in any other case. He went through old HOA newsletters, community reports, and payment logs. Most of it was boring, but then he noticed something strange. The HOA had a maintenance fund listed on every annual report. It was supposed to cover lawn care, park upkeep, and seasonal decorations. But for the last 6 months, the fund balance hadn't changed at all, even though he knew for a fact that the landscapers had been working every week. Someone was paying them, but it wasn't showing up in the books. Mark made a note of that and called the landscaping company listed on the last official contract. The owner, a polite man named Doug, answered. "Hey Doug, this is Mark Reynolds from the Brookside Neighborhood HOA," he said casually. "Just checking on some payment records for our maintenance work. Everything going smoothly on your end?" Yeah," Doug replied. "We're good. You guys have been paying on time every month." "That's good to hear," Mark said. "Just one more thing. Who's been sending those payments lately? I want to make sure our records match." There was a short pause. "I've been getting checks directly from one of your HOA reps. I think her name's Karen. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. Karen Whitmore? Yeah, that's her. She usually drops the check off in person. Real strict lady, but always punctual. Thanks, Doug, Mark said, keeping his tone calm. You've been a big help. He hung up and leaned back in his chair. So, Karen had been paying vendors directly. That meant she wasn't just collecting money from homeowners. She was handling official HOA payments, too. That was a big red flag. The next morning, he met with Paul and the treasurer in the community clubhouse. The treasurer, a quiet woman named Linda, had brought a box of receipts and check copies. Mark laid everything out on the table. According to the landscaping company, Karen's been paying them directly. That means she had access to the HOA's checkbook or a separate account. Linda frowned. I don't remember approving any secondary account. Could she have made one herself? Paul asked. Linda hesitated. If she had the HOA's tax ID number and a few documents, maybe. She used to handle mail for us, so it's possible she took some forms. Mark nodded slowly. If that's the case, she might have been collecting money and using it to make small payments enough to look legitimate, while keeping the rest. Paul rubbed his forehead. This is bad, isn't it? It's not good, Mark said simply. But we'll get to the bottom of it. Over the next week, Mark spent every spare moment piecing things together. It felt strange investigating something so close to home. He wasn't in his office downtown, surrounded by detectives and files, just in his living room, with HOA papers spread across the table and his dog asleep at his feet. He found old emails between Karen and several contractors. The language was always the same. Please send invoices to my attention. I'll handle the payments personally. Don't bother the board with this. She'd been clever. By keeping everything efficient and off the board's plate, she made herself seem helpful. Most people probably appreciated her taking initiative. No one suspected she was quietly building control over every financial thread of the HOA. Then came the detail that tied it all together. One of the residents, an older man named Henry, stopped by one evening. Heard you've been asking about the HOA stuff, he said. Thought you should see this. He handed Mark a photocopy of a check made out to K. Whitmore Services. Mark frowned. Where'd this come from? She fined me last month for having a non-approved fence color, Henry said. I didn't want trouble, so I just paid it. She said it was through her private account because the HOA's system was down. I didn't think much of it then. Mark studied the check. The account number at the bottom didn't match the HOA's official account. It was personal. That was the confirmation he needed. Now he had to decide what to do next. He could easily open a formal case. He had enough to involve financial crimes, but something told him to start with a quieter approach. Maybe, just maybe, she'd come clean on her own if she realized the truth was out. So he paid her a visit. It was late afternoon when he walked up to Karen's house. Her garden was perfect as always. Trimmed hedges, clean driveway, not a single leaf out of place. He knocked on the door and waited. After a few moments, she opened it wearing that same tight smile she always had. Mark, she said coolly. What brings you here? Just wanted to talk, he said calmly. Mind if I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course. The living room was spotless, almost too spotless, like no one actually lived there. Everything was arranged perfectly, from the books on the shelf to the framed photos on the wall. Mark sat down in one of the chairs while she stood near the doorway, arms crossed. So what's this about? I've been helping the HOA sort through some records, he said casually. Found a few things that don't add up. Payments, fines, separate accounts. Her expression stiffened. I don't know what you're implying. He leaned forward slightly. I think you do. The landscaping company says you've been paying them directly. Several residents said they gave you fine payments. And there's at least one check made out to your name. That's not procedure, Karen. Her voice rose a little. You have no right to come into my home and accuse me of anything. I'm not accusing you, Mark said evenly. I'm giving you a chance to explain before this goes any further. She glared at him for a long moment. You think you're so clever, don't you? Just because you wear a badge. This has nothing to do with that, he said calmly. This is about the community. About the people who trusted you. For a second, he saw something flicker in her expression. Maybe guilt, maybe fear. But then she straightened her shoulders. You can't prove anything, she said. Mark stood. We'll see. He walked out without another word. That night, he put everything together in a clean report. Dates, names, evidence, even copies of the checks. The next morning he handed it to Paul and the treasurer. "This is enough to file an internal complaint," he said. "If you want, I can forward it to the Financial Crimes Unit downtown." Paul looked overwhelmed. "I didn't realize she'd gone this far." "People like her rarely start big," Mark said. "It begins small, one shortcut, one little lie. Then it grows." They agreed to let him handle the next steps quietly. For now, the goal was to protect the neighborhood while gathering more proof. Meanwhile, rumors spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors started sharing stories. How Karen had fined them for things that weren't even violations. How she demanded urgent payments. How she'd threatened to have their fences removed. People began to realize how much fear she'd created. One afternoon, as Mark walked his dog, an older woman stopped him. "Thank you for standing up to her," she said softly. "We were all afraid to say anything." He smiled gently. "You shouldn't have to be afraid in your own neighborhood." By the end of that week, the board froze all HOA accounts and removed Karen's access. That was when things really shifted. Without her control, everything started surfacing. Emails, receipts, messages she thought no one would ever see. She'd been collecting violation payments for almost a year. Not thousands, but enough to make it serious. Mark made sure everything was handled by the book. He wasn't out for revenge. He just wanted fairness. He forwarded his findings to the city's financial office for review. A few days later, an investigator reached out to him directly. "We've reviewed the documents," the investigator said. "You did the right thing bringing this forward. We'll take it from here." After that, Mark stepped back. His part was done. The neighborhood would handle the rest. For the first time in months, things began to calm down again. People started talking to each other more. Kids played outside without their parents worrying about violations. Even small things like leaving trash cans out a bit longer didn't turn into drama anymore. Still, Mark couldn't help but reflect on how quickly one person's need for control had affected so many lives. He'd seen corruption before in big cases involving big money, but this was different. This was personal. This was about power. The kind of quiet power that seeps into everyday life when no one's watching. A week later, he got a call from Paul. "You'll want to know," Paul said, "the HOA had a special meeting today." Karen's officially removed from the board. The city's reviewing her financial records. She's not taking it well, but it's out of our hands now. Mark thanked him and hung up. That evening, he took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the rows of houses. A few neighbors waved from their porches. Someone was grilling nearby. It felt like the neighborhood was breathing again, like it had finally been set free from a quiet kind of fear. He smiled to himself. Sometimes justice wasn't about courtrooms or arrests. Sometimes it was about peace returning where it had been missing for too long. As he reached his driveway, he looked across the street. Karen's house was dark. Her car was gone. For the first time in a long while, the street was still. He stood there for a moment, just listening to the quiet. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt relieved, because the truth, when handled right, didn't need to shout. It just needed to be seen. And though he didn't know it yet, what he had uncovered was only part of the story. There was still more beneath the surface. Records Karen had hidden, payments that hadn't yet been traced. But for now, the neighborhood slept peacefully again. And for Mark, that was enough. A week after Karen was removed from the Homeowners Association board, the neighborhood began to feel normal again. People were starting to smile more, and conversations that once ended awkwardly now lasted longer. The air was lighter somehow, as if a heavy curtain had finally been lifted, but even as things calmed on the surface, there was still more to uncover. The city's financial office had just begun their review, and Mark knew that when professionals started digging, things could get messy. He wasn't officially involved anymore, at least not in any formal way, but his background as a detective made him the natural person everyone still turned to when they had a question. He didn't mind. He cared about the people who lived around him. One afternoon, the HOA treasurer, Linda, showed up at his door again with a worried look. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. "Of course," Mark said, stepping aside so she could come in. She sat down at the kitchen table, clutching a manila folder. "We got an email from the city investigator today," she said, sliding the folder across to him. "They found something strange. It looks like there might be another account we didn't know about. Mark frowned and opened the folder. Inside were a few printed bank statements with partial information. There were transactions, regular ones, linked to a local community foundation. The account name didn't say HOA. It was labeled Neighborhood Improvement Fund. That name sounds harmless, Linda said quietly. But this isn't an official HOA fund. I checked. Mark studied the transactions carefully. Look here, he said, pointing to a line on the page. Payments made to landscaping companies, pool cleaning, and even the security system. She used this account to cover legitimate expenses, but that means people's dues weren't going into the real HOA account at all. She was redirecting them here. So that's why the main account balance wasn't changing, Linda said. It looked normal on paper, but the money was going somewhere else first. Mark leaned back, thinking. She must have created this account under a non-profit name, just similar enough that the bank didn't question it. She probably used the HOA's address and tax number to make it look official. Linda shook her head. She really thought of everything. People like her usually do, Mark said quietly. They plan for months before anyone catches on. Later that night, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, thinking over everything. The crickets were chirping and a light breeze rustled the trees. He could see the faint glow from a few windows down the street, where neighbors were winding down for the night. It was peaceful, but in his gut he knew the situation wasn't finished yet. The next morning, the city investigator called him directly. "Mr. Reynolds, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," the man said politely. "Your name came up in our notes as someone who's been helping the HOA." "Of course," Mark said. "What's going on?" "We've confirmed that the secondary account, the one labeled Neighborhood Improvement Fund, was opened 2 years ago under the HOA's tax ID. The authorized signatory is listed as Karen Whitmore. It's definitely connected." Mark let out a slow breath. "So she's been funneling money through that account for a long time." "Yes," the investigator said. "But here's the odd part. The account's closing balance is almost zero. All the funds have been transferred out to another holding account under her personal name." Mark stayed quiet for a moment, taking that in. "Do you know how much?" "About $38,000, the investigator replied. "That's more than just a small mistake," Mark said. "It's being treated as a financial crime now," the investigator said. "We'll be contacting everyone in the HOA soon, but since you're the board's point of contact, I wanted you to know first." After he hung up, Mark sat back in his chair and stared at the floor. He wasn't surprised, but there was still something sad about it. He'd seen plenty of cases where greed took over, but this one was closer to home. That evening, he attended an emergency HOA meeting in the clubhouse. The room was full. More people than usual showed up, some curious, others clearly frustrated. Paul stood at the front, holding a few papers in his hands. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know the last few weeks have been tense, but we have updates. The city's investigation confirmed that funds were misused from the HOA accounts. They're handling it now." A murmur spread through the room. People exchanged glances. Someone in the back asked, "How much did she take?" Paul hesitated, glancing at Mark. Mark stepped forward. "Around $38,000, he said quietly. "But the good news is that the city has frozen her accounts and is working to recover what they can. The important thing is that the neighborhood is safe and our HOA will be restructured so this never happens again." The room went silent for a few seconds. Then the questions started. Why no one noticed earlier, how she had managed to get control, what would happen next. Mark answered as honestly as he could. "Karen was smart," he said. "She earned trust by doing extra work, and most people don't question someone who volunteers to help. But from now on, every transaction will go through 2 signatures. There will be quarterly audits, and all HOA meetings will be open to everyone." That seemed to calm some people down. Still, the tension lingered. It was hard for them to accept that someone they'd seen every day could have done something like that. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached Mark personally. "We really appreciate what you've done," one man said. "I don't think we'd ever have figured this out on our own." Mark smiled faintly. "I just did what anyone would do." But deep down, he knew not everyone would have stepped in. It's easy to look away from small problems until they grow too big to ignore. The following week, the city's investigation became official news. A few local reporters showed up at the neighborhood gate, asking questions. Mark stayed quiet. He didn't want publicity. All he wanted was to make sure things returned to normal. Then one afternoon, as he was getting his mail, a familiar car pulled up across the street. It was Karen's. She stepped out looking tired and angry, wearing large sunglasses even though the sky was cloudy. The few neighbors nearby froze, watching her cautiously. She walked straight toward him. "Are you proud of yourself?" she asked bitterly. "You've ruined my life." Mark looked at her calmly. "You did that yourself, Karen. I was trying to help this neighborhood." She snapped. "Do you think I wanted things to fall apart? I kept things organized. I made sure people followed the rules. No one appreciated how much work I did." He took a slow breath. "Taking money isn't helping, Karen. Controlling people out of fear isn't leadership. You went too far." Her voice cracked slightly. "You don't understand. Everyone took advantage of me. I just wanted a little respect." Mark's expression softened for a moment. "Respect isn't something you can force," he said gently. "You earn it by doing right by people." She didn't reply. Her eyes filled with tears for a brief moment before she turned and got back into her car. Without another word, she drove off down the street. He stood there quietly watching her go. It was hard to feel satisfaction in that moment. What he saw wasn't just guilt. It was someone who'd built her entire identity around control. And when that control was taken away, there was nothing left to hold on to. The next few days passed quietly. The neighborhood kept moving forward. The new HOA board worked hard to rebuild trust. They started holding small community events again, barbecues, cleanup days, and movie nights at the park. For the first time in a long while, people were smiling at each other without tension in their eyes. Mark tried to focus on normal life again. He went back to work, handled his cases, and stopped checking his HOA emails as much. But every now and then, when he drove down the street and saw the old sign at the neighborhood entrance, "Welcome to Brookside Community," he couldn't help but think of how fragile trust could be. One evening, he received a call from the city investigator again. "Just wanted to update you," the man said. "The case is nearly closed. We were able to recover most of the funds through her accounts. She's agreed to restitution and community service instead of a trial." "That's probably for the best," Mark said quietly. "She'll be barred from managing any financial organization for several years," the investigator added. "You did a good thing bringing this forward." After the call, Mark stepped outside and sat on the porch again. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun set. The air smelled like freshly cut grass, and kids were laughing somewhere down the street. He realized then that sometimes justice didn't mean punishment. It meant balance being restored. A few days later, at the next HOA meeting, Paul stood before everyone again. "I have good news," he said. "The city has officially closed the investigation. The missing funds are being returned, and we're launching new neighborhood projects with full transparency." The room broke into soft applause. People looked genuinely relieved. Linda smiled and handed Mark a small plaque the board had made. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple wooden sign that read, "In appreciation of your service to the Brookside community." Mark chuckled softly. "You didn't have to do that," Paul grinned. "Maybe not, but we wanted to." It felt strange being thanked for something that to him was just the right thing to do, but as he looked around the room, the neighbors chatting, the laughter filling the air, he realized that this small gesture meant more than any medal or commendation ever could. That night, as he walked home, he passed by the old park where Karen used to hold her HOA meetings. The benches had been repainted, and the new board had put up fairy lights around the trees. It looked warm, inviting, and full of life again. He paused for a moment, staring at the scene. In a strange way, all the chaos had brought the community closer together. People had learned to trust again, not just in each other, but in fairness, in honesty, and in speaking up when something felt wrong. As he continued down the path toward his house, he heard laughter from a nearby yard. Families were gathered around fire pits, sharing food and stories. It was the kind of peaceful night that made all the effort worth it. When he reached his front door, he glanced back one more time at the quiet street. The porch lights glowed softly. The breeze carried the smell of grilled food, and for the first time in months he felt a deep, satisfying calm. He had done what he set out to do. He didn't need recognition, and he didn't want attention. All he wanted was to protect the sense of peace that every neighborhood deserves. And as he locked his door and turned off the lights, He knew deep down that this story wasn't just about catching someone who did wrong. It was about reminding people that even in the smallest communities, doing the right thing still mattered. Because sometimes real justice isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the sound of a peaceful street after months of tension. It's neighbors waving again. It's the gentle rhythm of normal life returning. And that, for Mark, was all the closure he needed. Months had passed since the investigation ended, and the Brookside neighborhood had finally settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful again. The flowers along the sidewalks had started blooming, kids were back to riding their bikes, and the air carried that quiet hum of ordinary life that people often took for granted. Mark found himself smiling more these days. He wasn't thinking about bank statements or hidden accounts anymore. Instead, he spent his mornings walking his dog around the lake trail, waving to neighbors who now greeted him with genuine warmth instead of polite distance. It was strange how different the same place could feel once fear was gone. The homeowners association had changed too. Paul stepped down after helping to stabilize things, saying he wanted to focus on his family. Linda stayed on as treasurer, but now worked alongside 2 new volunteers who double-checked everything. Meetings were open to anyone, and residents actually showed up, not to complain, but to contribute ideas. They even started a Brookside renewal project, where neighbors could pitch ideas for small improvements, like repainting mailboxes or planting new trees. Mark wasn't on the board, but they often invited him to meetings anyway. He always sat near the back, sipping coffee and watching the community come alive again. There was something beautiful about seeing people work together after so much division. One evening, after a meeting ended, Paul pulled him aside. "You know," he said, "if you ever wanted to take an official role, everyone would vote you in without hesitation." Mark laughed softly. "I think I'll stay where I am. I do better watching from the sidelines." Paul nodded with a grin. "Fair enough. Just know we all trust you now more than anyone." That simple sentence meant more to Mark than Paul probably realized. Trust, it was the thing Karen had broken and the thing he'd helped restore. And for Mark, that was the real reward. But despite all the calm, a small part of him couldn't help but wonder how Karen was doing. He hadn't seen her since that day she confronted him on the street. Some neighbors said she'd moved away to stay with her sister in another town. Others thought she was keeping to herself somewhere nearby. He didn't wish her harm. He just hoped she found peace. Because in his years as a detective, he'd seen too many people destroy themselves over pride and control. And if anything, this whole situation reminded him how easy it was to lose sight of what truly mattered. A few weeks later, he got his answer unexpectedly. It was a Saturday morning. He'd just finished trimming the bushes out front when a car he didn't recognize pulled into his driveway. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans as the driver's side door opened. It was Karen. She looked different, tired, older somehow. Her hair was shorter, and she wore simple clothes instead of her usual crisp outfits. She held a brown envelope in her hands and gave him a cautious nod. "Morning," she said quietly. "Morning," he replied. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I figured you wouldn't," she said. "Can I come in for a minute?" "I won't stay long," he hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." They sat in the living room, the same place where he'd gone over all the HOA paperwork months before. The memory felt distant now. Karen placed the envelope on the coffee table. "I wanted to give you this," she said. "It's a letter from the city. They finished everything. The case is officially closed and restitution's been paid." He nodded. "I heard from the board. They said the money came back. I'm glad." She looked down at her hands. "I know you probably think I'm a terrible person. Maybe I was. But for what it's worth, I didn't start out trying to steal from anyone. It just got away from me." Mark didn't interrupt. He let her talk. "I thought if I handled everything myself, people would finally respect me," she said quietly. "When you're the one in charge, it feels like power, but it also eats at you. You start lying to keep it even to yourself, and before you know it, you don't even recognize the person you've become." Mark took a slow breath. "It's good that you can admit that now." She gave a small, sad smile. "Yeah, the city gave me community service instead of jail time. I volunteer at a food pantry now. It's humbling, but it's teaching me something I should have learned years ago." He nodded. That doing things for others isn't about control, it's about care. She looked at him for a moment and her eyes softened.